Oil dripped in slow, stubborn beads from the cracked gasket, hitting the concrete floor with soft, accusing splashes. The garage smelled of grease, burnt metal, and faintly of rain from the storm outside. Light fell in narrow shafts through the high, dusty windows, illuminating a girl crouched over a rusted carburetor. Her hair was tied back with a frayed ribbon, but strands had escaped to cling to her cheeks. 13-year-old Amara Khan moved with deliberate care, her small hands surprisingly steady for someone who'd been awake since dawn. This wasn't a hobby. It was survival. After a full day at school and an hour at the grocery store stocking shelves, she'd come straight here, to the back room of her uncle's repair shop. The tools were mostly secondhand, their wooden handles worn smooth from decades of use, but she handled them like precision instruments. Every turn of the wrench, every twist of wire, was accompanied by the faint hum of her thoughts, calculated, measured, unwilling to waste a single motion. In school, she was not so composed. The auto shop class was supposed to be an elective, a place for hands-on learners, but for Amara, it was a gauntlet. She was the only girl in the class, the only one who didn't grow up swapping spark plugs in her father's garage, the only one without a shiny set of chrome-plated tools. She was also the smallest, which made it easier for Ethan, the class's self-appointed king, to loom over her shoulder and remind her, in his signature smirk, that she didn't belong. "Engines aren't dollhouses, Con," he'd said just that morning, tossing a bolt in the air and catching it with irritating precision. His friends laughed like it was the cleverest insult in the world. The teacher, Mr. Grady, didn't openly agree, but he didn't stop them either. He assigned her the junk table at the back, piles of bent rods, warped housings, and stripped screws that no one else wanted to touch. When they had their first-time challenge to assemble a working starter motor, Amara sputtered twice before dying completely. Laughter rolled through the shop like a wave. Her cheeks burned, but her eyes didn't drop. She simply gathered her tools, set the motor aside, and began again, even though the clock had already run out. Ethan caught her glance as she worked and gave her that slow, lazy grin that said, "I've already won." That afternoon, the tension in her chest eased only when she walked past the pastures at her uncle's small ranch. The land was quiet except for the wind tugging at the dry grass. At the far end of the fence stood Shadow, a black stallion with a deep scar across his flank, the kind that told a story no one wanted to repeat. He was skittish, head low, muscles tense as though still waiting for the next blow. She approached him slowly, letting the cold iron of the fence press against her palms. His ears flicked toward her, but he didn't step back. She stayed there for minutes, just breathing the same air, until his shoulders loosened slightly. She understood that. Shadow was like her, damaged, underestimated, expected to fade quietly into the background. Later that evening, as she wiped down the shop's counters, voices drifted in from the front. Ethan and his crew had stopped by to talk to her uncle about a part. Their conversation shifted just enough for her to catch the sharp edge of their words. "She won't last 2 weeks," Ethan said. "We've got 100 riding on it. Whoever makes her quit gets the pot." The others laughed, their sneakers squeaking on the tile as they left. Amara stayed where she was, rag frozen in her hand. A hot pulse of humiliation flooded her chest, followed by something sharper, an almost electric jolt of defiance. They weren't just waiting for her to fail. They were betting on it. That night, she rummaged through the attic, ignoring the dust and the occasional creak of the old boards. In a battered trunk, beneath a folded quilt, she found what she was looking for, her late mother's engineering notebooks. The pages smelled faintly of ink and machine oil. Her mother's handwriting was tight and precise, diagrams marked with arrows and numbers. One sketch in particular caught her eye, a compact, fuel-less rotary engine, incomplete but promising. She traced the lines with her fingertips, heart beating faster. It was nothing like the lumbering gas engines in class. This was clean, efficient, and decades ahead of its time. Somewhere outside, the storm deepened, rain lashing against the roof. The wind rattled the window frame, but Amara barely noticed. She sat cross-legged on the floor, notebook balanced on her knees, reading her mother's notes as if they were a map to buried treasure. Her uncle called her name once from downstairs, but she didn't answer. She closed the notebook slowly, as though sealing a pact. Her reflection in the dusty window was pale but steady-eyed. The bet didn't matter anymore. Neither did Ethan. This was about something bigger, finishing what her mother had started, proving that genius didn't require permission. In the dim glow of her desk lamp, she set the notebook beside her tools and whispered to the empty room, "Let's finish what you started, Mom." The rain outside seemed to answer, steady and relentless. The shed behind her uncle's house became Amara's sanctuary. By day, it looked like nothing more than a weathered structure with peeling paint and a crooked tin roof. But at night, under the yellow light of a single hanging bulb, it transformed into a workshop where time seemed to fold in on itself. Piles of scavenged parts leaned against the walls, carburetors, brake drums, and coils stacked in careful order. On the workbench lay her mother's notebook, pages already smudged with fresh graphite from her own sketches. Progress was slow. Her hands blistered from the stubborn metal, and more than once she miscalculated the torque on a bolt, snapping it clean in two. Sparks from the welder bit into her sleeves, leaving small holes in the fabric. But each setback only sharpened her focus. She began to lose track of hours, working until her neck ached and her eyes burned from staring too long at blueprints under the dim light. One rainy afternoon, while combing through bins at the scrapyard for usable bearings, she caught the attention of an older woman stacking metal sheets into a truck bed. The woman's frame was wiry, her movements deliberate, as though each lift had been calculated for efficiency. She wore thick work gloves and a leather apron, her gray hair braided down her back. "You keep taking parts from the wrong pile," the woman said, without looking up. Amara straightened, caught between embarrassment and irritation. "I'm looking for bearings. The ones over there are too worn to use." The woman finally glanced at her, sharp-eyed. "And the ones you're picking now will seize within a month. You know how to read wear patterns." Amara hesitated. "I can figure it out." The woman smirked. "I'm sure you can. But figuring it out and doing it right aren't always the same thing." She tossed a bearing toward Amara, who caught it instinctively. "That one will last." Her name was Mrs. Ellery, a retired mechanical engineer who'd spent 40 years designing industrial machinery. Over the next weeks, Amara found excuses to visit the scrapyard more often, timing her trips for when Mrs. Ellery was there. The older woman was blunt, never offering praise without reason. She forced Amara to show her calculations on paper before allowing her to move on to the next step. When Amara protested, she'd simply shrug and say, "If you can't prove it works on paper, it won't work in steel." The lessons were not just mechanical. Amara learned to think in layers, to see not only the parts but the forces passing between them, the heat, the friction, the potential for failure. She learned that patience wasn't the absence of urgency, but the discipline to move forward without rushing. In the meantime, her connection with Shadow deepened. The stallion no longer kept his distance when she approached the fence. He would lower his head, allowing her to run a hand along the smooth line of his neck. His limp was still visible, but his stride grew surer each week. She spoke to him softly while she worked near the pasture, telling him about the engine, about Mrs. Ellery's impossible questions, about the way Ethan's smirk tightened whenever her work in class didn't fail. The first real breakthrough came during a class assignment to rebuild a lawnmower engine. Mr. Grady handed each team a box of disassembled parts and a time limit of 2 hours. Ethan's group finished in under an hour, leaning back with smug confidence. Amara worked alone at her station, methodically cleaning each part before reassembling it. She could feel eyes on her, waiting for the familiar sputter of defeat. When she pulled the cord, the engine roared to life on the first try. The sound was sharp, clean, no coughing, no hesitation. A few students glanced at each other, muttering. Ethan's jaw tightened. Mr. Grady gave a short nod, not quite a smile, but his gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than usual. At home, the glow of that victory dimmed quickly. Bills sat stacked on the kitchen counter. Her uncle, shoulders slumped, stared at them in silence. "If things don't change, I might have to sell Shadow," he said finally. Feed costs alone, his voice trailed off, heavy with reluctance. The thought lodged itself deep in her chest. Shadow was no longer just a horse in the field. He was a quiet companion in this uphill climb, a reminder that recovery was possible. She couldn't let him go. That night she worked harder than ever, flipping through her mother's diagrams until the edges of the pages curled from handling. She could almost hear Mrs. Ellery's voice in her head, demanding proof, precision, perfection. But the more she refined the design, the more she saw gaps in her understanding. Heat distribution didn't match her projections. Rotational efficiency fell short of the intended output. She reworked the math again and again, chasing an answer that refused to settle. On the third night, without proper sleep, she finally bolted the new prototype to the bench for testing. The hum of the motor started promisingly, then deepened into a harsh grind. Before she could cut the power, the casing shuddered and split with a loud pop. Smoke filled the shed, acrid and stinging. She staggered back, coughing, her heart pounding in her ears. The engine sat before her in ruin, months of careful work undone in seconds. Her uncle appeared in the doorway, eyes wide at the smoke curling toward the rafters. "Kid, maybe it's time to quit," he said softly, his voice carrying no malice, only concern. She didn't answer. The sound of his retreating footsteps faded, leaving her alone with the acrid haze and the faint ticking of metal cooling under the bulb's dim light. Her hands trembled, not from fear but from the weight of a choice she wasn't ready to make. The shed stayed cold for days after the explosion, as if the air itself remembered the failure. Amara couldn't bring herself to cross the threshold. Tools lay scattered where she'd dropped them, the scorched shell of the prototype still bolted to the bench, its twisted casing a silent accusation. Each time she passed the door, a hollow feeling opened in her chest. At school, the weight of her absence from the workshop hung heavy. Mr. Grady didn't ask why she skipped the after-hours lab sessions, and Ethan didn't bother with taunts. His silence was almost worse. She kept her head down, avoiding both the curious and the cruel. Shadow noticed first. When she lingered by the pasture fence without stepping closer, his ears twitched forward, and he paced, snorting softly. She rested her arms on the top rail, watching the scarred stallion's movements. His limp was still there, faint but noticeable, and it mirrored her own invisible hesitation. She wanted to tell him it was over, that she had nothing left to give, but her throat closed around the words. The breaking point came late one night. She stood in her room, gathering the notebooks and sketches, shoving them into a box. Her fingers brushed against the worn leather cover of her mother's engineering journal, and she froze. Tucked inside, hidden between the diagrams, was an envelope she'd never noticed before. Her name was written on it in her mother's looping script. She sat on the edge of the bed, tearing the seal with trembling hands. The letter inside was brief, its edges yellowed, the ink faded, but still legible. Her mother wrote of her dream to build an engine that could run clean, independent of fossil fuels, one that could help rural communities escape the grip of fuel shortages and high costs. She wrote about the first tests, the failures, the corrections, about how she believed her daughter would one day surpass her. "I won't always be here to guide you," the letter ended, "but the work doesn't end with me. It ends when the world no longer needs it." Amara's eyes blurred with tears, but the words burned into her mind, steady and unyielding. She could almost feel her mother's presence in the room, as if those sentences were an unbroken thread pulling her back from the edge. Downstairs, the sound of rain began, soft against the roof. Shadow's distant whinny carried through the night, pulling her from the bed. She slipped into her coat and stepped outside. The stallion stood by the fence, head lifted, rain glistening along his dark coat. His gaze met hers, steady and unwavering. "I can't quit," she whispered, though the words felt like an admission as much as a vow. The next morning at school, an announcement caught her attention. The regional auto technology competition was only a month away. The prize was a scholarship and an industrial sponsorship, a chance to move beyond the cramped shed and into a real engineering lab. Ethan, leaning against a locker, grinned at his friends. "Easy win this year. I've got a new fuel injection system that'll blow the judges away." His confidence was infectious among his circle, their laughter filling the hall. Amara stood quietly in the background, eyes fixed on the flyer. When the sign-up sheet reached her, she wrote her name without hesitation. That night, she walked into the shed again. The smoke stains still marked the ceiling, and the smell of burnt oil clung stubbornly to the walls, but she didn't let herself pause. She unbolted the ruined prototype, salvaging what she could. Pieces of aluminum, a half-melted housing, scorched wiring, every salvageable fragment went into a separate bin. She cleared the bench, laid out fresh paper, and began again. Her first call was to Mrs. Ellery. The older woman didn't sound surprised. "I was wondering when you'd be back," she said. "You've got 4 weeks. That's not a lot of time, but it's enough if you're willing to work harder than you thought possible." The days blurred. Mornings began before dawn. Evenings stretched past midnight. At school, she endured Ethan's sideways glances, knowing he was waiting for her to fold. After classes, she split her time between the shed and the scrapyard, Mrs. Ellery's voice pushing her to refine each calculation. Heat efficiency had to be perfect. Weight distribution had to balance without excess strain on the rotary assembly. Her uncle noticed the change. He didn't say much, but sometimes he left a sandwich on her workbench or a thermos of tea by the door. Shadow lingered near the fence when she worked outside, watching her with quiet attention. The parallel was unmistakable, the stallion's gait growing stronger, her design sharpening with each day. 3 weeks in, she ran her first small-scale test. The prototype hummed, smooth and steady, no smoke, no rattle. Her pulse raced as she measured the output, clean, efficient, matching her projections almost exactly. She allowed herself a rare smile before shutting it down. There was still work to be done, refinements to make, but for the first time, she felt the weight of possibility instead of failure. In the final week, she focused on durability. She tested under heat, under simulated load, pushing the engine to the edge of its tolerance. Each trial revealed tiny flaws, too much vibration in the mount, a subtle drift in the thermal balance. She fixed them all. Sleep became a luxury she didn't allow herself. The night before the competition, she sat in the shed, staring at the finished prototype. It was smaller than the engines her classmates worked on, its design elegant in its simplicity. She ran her hand over the smooth casing, the metal cool beneath her palm. "You're ready," she murmured, though whether she was speaking to the engine or to herself was unclear. Competition day dawned clear and cold. The air in the school gym buzzed with energy. Contestants wheeled in polished machines gleaming under the overhead lights. Ethan's table was impossible to miss, his engine large, chrome-plated, intimidating. He caught sight of her modest setup and smirked. "Cute toy. Hope it runs longer than your last one." Amara didn't answer. She adjusted the clamps on her display stand, her focus narrowing to the task ahead. Around her, voices rose, tools clinked, judges circulated with clipboards. She thought of her mother's letter, of Mrs. Ellery's relentless questions, of Shadow's steady gaze in the rain. When the judges reached her station, she took a breath and began her explanation. Words came easier than she expected, about thermal differentials, mechanical rotation efficiency, and the absence of emissions. She kept her tone measured, letting the design speak for itself. They nodded, asking for a demonstration. She connected the leads, flipped the switch, and the engine came to life with a soft hum. No smoke, no wasted motion. The readings on the monitor climbed steadily, holding within fractions of her projections. But out of the corner of her eye, she saw movement. Ethan, leaning casually against her table, his elbow nudging a cable. The connector shifted just enough to break contact. The hum faltered. Without thinking, she dropped to one knee, fingers flying to reconnect the lead. The crowd murmured, the judges watching intently. She tightened the fitting, secured the clamps, and hit the switch again. The hum returned, steady as a heartbeat. When she looked up, Ethan's smirk had slipped. The judges exchanged glances, murmuring in low voices. One leaned closer to the monitor, eyebrows lifting. Another scribbled a note. The gymnasium had grown so quiet that Amara could hear the faint ticking of her engine cooling beside her. The judges stood in a tight circle at the front of the room, their heads bent together, voices lost under the thick blanket of anticipation. Contestants shifted restlessly, the scrape of a chair leg or the snap of a pen sounding too loud in the stillness. Her hands, clasped behind her back, were damp with sweat, but her face remained calm. She glanced toward Ethan's table. His engine sat gleaming, every curve of metal polished to a mirror finish, but his confidence seemed to have dulled. He caught her eye briefly, then looked away, jaw tightening. One of the judges stepped forward with a clipboard. His voice carried easily in the quiet space. "Third place," he announced, naming a boy from another school whose diesel hybrid had impressed the crowd. Applause rose and fell quickly. "Second place," the judge continued, "Ethan Caro, with his advanced fuel injection system." There was a pause, a ripple in the air, as people registered the result. Ethan's expression froze, then cracked into a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. He accepted the ribbon with stiff movements. His friends clapped half-heartedly. "And first place," the judge said, "goes to Amara Khan for her groundbreaking clean rotary engine prototype." For a moment, she wasn't sure she'd heard correctly. The words seemed suspended in the air, weightless. Then the applause surged, filling the gym like a tide breaking free. She stepped forward, each movement deliberate, steady. The ribbon was placed in her hand, along with an envelope containing the scholarship offer. One of the judges, an older woman with sharp eyes and a faint smile, leaned in as she handed it over. "What you've built here," she murmured, "isn't just a project. It's a beginning." When the applause died down, Ethan passed her on his way out. He didn't speak, but the absence of mockery was louder than anything he could have said. The weeks that followed moved quickly. Photos of her and the engines circulated online. Local news crews visited her uncle's ranch, filming her in the shed, asking about her design process. She spoke carefully, crediting her mother's notes, Mrs. Ellery's mentorship, and the countless hours spent refining each component. Shadow appeared in more than one photo, his head just visible over the pasture fence. People commented on the image of the girl and the stallion, calling it symbolic, though for Amara, it was simply truth. He had healed alongside her, step for step. The scholarship allowed her to enter a specialized engineering program, and the sponsorship brought funding to build a full-scale model. She traveled to competitions in other states, then to conferences abroad, each time carrying her mother's notebook in her bag. Offers began to arrive from companies wanting to develop the engine, each promising its own vision of what her invention could become. She was careful, wary of anyone who saw it as a quick profit rather than a lasting change. Years passed, each one carrying her further from the dusty shed, yet never severing the connection. She returned to the ranch whenever she could, spending quiet mornings with Shadow, who had grown older but retained his steady gaze. The shed remained much as it had been, worn, small, but still holding the faint scent of oil and metal. Then came the day she received the letter from the Nobel Committee. At first, she thought it was another invitation to speak at a conference, but the words were clear. She had been awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics for her contributions to sustainable energy technology. The ceremony was held in an ornate hall, light pouring through tall windows onto polished marble floors. She stood at the podium, the metal heavy around her neck, facing an audience of scientists, dignitaries, and young students. Cameras clicked softly in the background. "I accept this honor," she began, her voice steady, "in memory of my mother, whose vision lit the path I followed. I accept it for my mentor, Mrs. Ellery, who taught me the discipline to turn an idea into reality. And I accept it for every child told they don't belong in the workshop, the lab, or the field, that their hands are too small, their voices too quiet. We are not small. We are not quiet. We are building the future." Her gaze swept the room, settling briefly on a row of young girls in the front. They sat forward in their seats, eyes wide, notebooks open on their laps. She recognized something in their expressions: hunger, determination, the spark she'd once carried in the back of a high school auto shop. After the ceremony, as she stepped into the crisp evening air, she reached into her coat pocket. Her fingers brushed against a worn photograph. Shadow standing in the pasture, head turned toward the camera, the old scar still visible. She smiled, tucking it back safely. The world felt larger now, its demands more complex, but at its heart the journey was unchanged. The shed, the stallion, the notebook, they were not relics of the past. They were the foundation. And as long as engines turned and ideas sparked, she would keep building. Somewhere in the quiet, she could almost hear the hum of that first perfected prototype, steady and clean, carrying her forward.